Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Pittsburgh Current podcast from beautiful downtown Beachview Business District. I'm Charlie Deach, Pittsburgh Current editor, and we've got a good show today. We have newly announced 36th District State Rep candidate Jessica Benham is here, and I also want to let you know, though, that our fall guide is still on the streets. You can pick that up. We have more than 400 events between now and mid-December for you to take in. I mean, you don't have to do all 400 if you don't want to, but they're there in case you want them. A new issue of the Pittsburgh Current comes out this week, and we will have coverage of the Pittsburgh Real Q Film Festival, among many other things. So check that out. And also, if you're free on Saturday, I will be appearing on the Dangerously Live comedy talk show with John McIntyre, and I will be a guest along with the great Gab Bonesso and the great Bethany Hallam. I would come out and be prepared for, I'm sure, people to say the first thing that come to their mind. I think it'll be a good time. So it's at the Brillo Box, 6 p.m., $20 entry, Dangerously Live with John McIntyre's 10th anniversary show. So check it out. But today we're going to talk politics, and we will be talking politics on Saturday, but this is of the local variety. And I have to say I was very happy / excited when I got a press release this week from Jessica Benham's campaign that she's going to be launching a challenge against 25-year incumbent Harry Readshaw in the 36th district. And we'll get into all of that, I'm sure. Jessica, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So we'll kind of set the stage a little bit. The district is South Hills area of Pittsburgh. Harry Readshaw is a Democrat. Democrat, and that's my own opinion. That's certainly, that doesn't reflect the opinion of anyone else. It does, but no, I don't want to speak for them actually. But he very much is conservative when it comes to things like gun control and other sorts of issues. But I think we have in Jessica, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think you will, but is a progressive challenger to Harry. Jessica, what made you decide to take on this challenge at this time?
Absolutely. So I am running because it is time that District 36 was represented by someone who upholds progressive democratic values.
Right. And definitely, even if folks want to say that Harry's liberal, I don't think they could say that Harry is progressive, to say the least. What kind of first? Let's talk a little bit about yourself. You co-founded a nonprofit to help folks with autism, and you could tell us a little bit about that, and tell us a little bit about how you got into that and how that sort of rolled into a political interest.
So when I moved back home to Pittsburgh, I did that thing that a lot of Pittsburghers do.
Sure.
I left to go to college and then boomeranged right back. So my mom is very happy that I'm back in Pittsburgh.
I'm sure.
But when I came back, I was looking for community with other people who were like me, particularly other autistic people.
Right.
And I found that there were some groups for autistic people, but they were mainly composed of white men.
Right.
And white straight men. And so looking for community that was reflective of my entire identity, I found the local chapter of the Pittsburgh Center for Autistic Advocacy, which at the time was run by my good friend, Corey Frazier. And after talking, we realized that we needed more than just a support group. We needed more than just one monthly meeting. So we put our heads together, and with a group of other folks who have become our steering committee, we created the Pittsburgh Center for Autistic Advocacy, and it is the only organization in the greater Pittsburgh area that does disability rights work that is run by autistic people for autistic people, and more specifically by autistic LGBT people.
Wow. And so that's one of the things I wanted to talk about was not only are you, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I think when you talk about a community, there is certainly, I would say, the autistic folks are a community within the city. Is that fair? Is that the proper way to say that? I want to make sure that, and then, but also you are a member of the LGBTQ community. And so I would think that there would not be a whole lot of places or spaces for you that sort of encompasses at least most of who you are. And so, did you find much in the way of pushback to sort of break into that kind of white male dominated kind of area? And then again, how do you then find other folks who are also part of the LGBTQ community?
So I think what we've done is built spaces that welcome LGBTQ autistic people. And certainly we also work with and serve autistic people who are not LGBTQ. I don't want to make us sound exclusive that way. But we've been really intentional about building spaces where folks who aren't straight or folks who aren't cis do feel comfortable. And so those spaces are, our social meetup or happy hours that we'll hold, or, at Pride, we do a sensory tent where we try to eliminate some of the noise. We bring STEM toys. We set up a really cozy space so that autistic folks who belong at Pride, right?
Yeah.
Autistic LGBTQ folks belong at Pride.
Yeah.
That they can feel welcome and feel that they have a place where they can go so that Pride is accessible to them.
And I would think it's important for there to be a group, because I think we've heard it not just with Pride, but with other not just LGBTQ groups, but if there's a subset of another community or a smaller community in a larger community, those folks are oftentimes overlooked and not necessarily, nobody's necessarily looking to find them and bring them in. So I would think it takes an organization or at least a really strong core group of folks to sort of, up the image or bring to the forefront that these folks are here and want to be part of the greater community at large.
Right. I think we have to talk about the fact that autism discourse has been dominated for a really long time by white people, by cis people, by straight people. And that's important. Yeah. And so when I'm talking about these things, I also want to acknowledge that I occupy a privileged position. I'm a white person. And as a bisexual person who is married to a man, I have the privilege of looking like I'm straight.
Right.
So I'm not exposed to the same dangers that folks who are not straight passing are. And that comes with its own limitations. Sure. Sometimes people will tell me things like, oh, you're not gay enough.
I was going to bring that up. That's one of the things I was going to bring up. If there are even within groups, there are stigmas and there are barriers even within the group. So how do you make it even more inclusive? Like what not maybe step by step, but what is sort of the idea behind, or what's the infrastructure, I guess, to sort of make sure that people aren't just, because it almost seems like it doesn't matter what it is at some point. Even in a smaller group, there still tends to be divisions or pushing someone to the side for this, that, the other reason. So how did you make sure that everyone was kind of accounted for and everyone was given a voice and a space?
So one of my biggest values, and a value that we've worked to develop really hard at the Pittsburgh Center, is cross-movement solidarity, which is to say, not only should we exist in solidarity with other movements, but we should acknowledge the ways in which all of us become part of different movements. Yeah. Right? I'm a disabled person. I'm also a union organizer. I'm a disabled person. I'm also bisexual. Yeah. And to be able to exist in all of those movement spaces as my whole self is incredibly important. Yeah. And so cross-movement solidarity as a value is something I hold to strongly, which is to say that no matter what movement space I'm in, I want to acknowledge the full humanity and the full personhood of anybody that I'm interacting with.
If this is too personal, just tell me. But how did you navigate that yourself personally? I mean, obviously, these things sort of, as we discover who we are and as we discover different things, I mean, you obviously, you were diagnosed at some point with autism. You at some point realized that you were bisexual, your sexuality, disabilities, and so how did you how did that experience What was that experience for you?
Yeah. So it's interesting, right? People like me don't run for office.
Right.
There's never been somebody like me
Right.
who's run for office successfully. And, growing up, when you don't see people who look like you or think like you or move like you in elected positions, how could that ever be something that you see yourself doing, right? I mean, I look back and I think about second grade Jessica, who was an awkward, gangly child who desperately wanted to be a bug scientist at the same time that a lot of my peers were thinking about being president.
Right.
Because looking around, nobody like me had ever done something like that. I failed out of second grade. If my second grade teacher could see me today, she wouldn't believe this. I remember her telling my parents in front of me that I was a bad child.
Wow.
And that I would come to nothing. And
in second grade.
In second grade.
Wow.
Yeah. And so that's something I will tell, when I do teacher trainings about autism or when I talk to parents, I'll say, it doesn't matter how young your child is. It doesn't matter what your child's disability is. They are listening. Yeah. And you should assume that they understand you.
At what age were you aware of that you had autism, and at what point? I mean, did you ever, as you said, you maybe felt a little awkward or different? But was that always kind of the case for you? And was that? I mean, let me tell you, I felt awkward and different a lot in school too. So was it just sort of the growing up, or was it part of the autism diagnosis, or what was at play there?
Yeah. So like many autistic women, I wasn't diagnosed until college.
Wow.
That's pretty typical. Because,
is it really? Why is that?
Well, when I was growing up in the 90s, autism was a thing that little white boys had.
Right.
And so when that's the stereotype, when Sheldon Cooper is the stereotype, somebody like me doesn't get that diagnosis. Yeah. And that means that somebody like me doesn't get those supports and services in school because you need the diagnosis for that. And so, it was that I felt different. I have felt different for as long as I can remember. Yeah. But it was also that I didn't understand why I was getting in trouble. I didn't understand why I wasn't doing well. I didn't understand why, other kids were able to form relationships and friendships in certain ways and I wasn't. So, I'll say I felt awkward and I felt out of place. But it was bigger than that because it was also systemic. It wasn't just, here's this nerd. Right. It was, here are all of these systemic barriers for somebody who's like me.
So were there attempts to, or was it just in someone's mind or in someone's training or whatever that they just decide it was disciplinary issues? Is that kind of what you were sort of tagged with, rather than trying to look at, is there something going on that is causing this behavior? Is that what happened?
So my mom tells me that, people suggested that she get me evaluated, but she didn't really want to label me, is what she says. And, I get that. Yeah. But for me, the label has been powerful. Yeah. It's helped me understand who I am. It's helped me find other people like me and develop and build community. And I'm proud to be autistic because it's been a journey for me. And, to parents who are thinking about, should their kid get diagnosed? Should they seek that for their child? And if their kid does get diagnosed, should they tell their child? Absolutely. Right.
What would be you work in this field. There are parents who would make the decision not to tell their child. And why is that? Is that a thing that they're trying to protect from a stigma, even though it might not be the best thing for the child in terms of coming to grips with what's going on with themselves?
I think there's some worry that the kid will feel othered or the kid will feel the burden of that stigma. But I always say, we get labeled in all kinds of ways. Sure. Right? Bad kid, weird kid, awkward kid. It's better to have a label that you can claim, that you can find connection with other people through, than a label that doesn't hold any of those same powers.
Wow. And so when you went to college, it sounded like, obviously there were issues in your academic career in the in the early stages. So, but you decided to go to college. Was that sort of, had you, so I guess explain to me how that whole transition went into college and then your diagnosis, how did that all come about?
Sure. So when I failed second grade, my mother pulled me out and homeschooled me. And she will say that like that first year, she basically spent letting me heal, letting me figure out who I was again and how to not live with that burden of feeling like a bad child.
Right.
And so I was homeschooled all the way up through my junior year of high school. And then I took some classes at Duquesne University and then eventually transferred. I think I found a lot of refuge in school.
Yeah.
Academics was something I was good at. And so for me, going to college was a way to, I guess, start over a little bit and figure out who I was as an adult.
And what took you to Minnesota? I know you went there for your undergrad, right?
I did.
I worked a little bit in North Wisconsin, so I'm familiar with the air. I'm familiar with the levels of snow that fall in those areas. So you were Minnesota State, correct?
So I got my master's degree at Minnesota State.
All right.
I went to a tiny liberal arts college called Bethel University.
Oh, yeah.
So I ended up there because they had an awesome speech and debate team.
Yeah.
To which I got a scholarship.
That's amazing.
So because of that scholarship and because of the speech and debate team, that's where I was able to find a lot of community at Bethel. And
how did you eventually end up with your diagnosis? Was it somebody suggesting that you get evaluated, or was it something that you decided on your own, or what happened?
Yeah, so college is stressful.
Sure.
Especially if you're different in the ways that I'm different. And so I went to therapy. I went to go see, hey, how do I figure out, how do I navigate that stress? Which I think is a very millennial thing.
Yeah.
There's that meme going around about, my therapist says.
Oh, right,
blah, blah,
right,
blah,
right,
blah.
right. Yeah.
And, that therapist said, hey, this sounds a lot like you might be on the autism spectrum.
Yeah.
And I said, huh. And I did some research and I said, wow, these women are telling stories that sound a lot like mine.
Right.
And so I sought that diagnosis because I wanted to know.
Yeah. And then how did it change? Don't presume. What did it change in terms? Did it change in way, perhaps in, how you learned? Or was it just how you saw yourself and maybe accepted yourself? What kind of things did the diagnosis bring you?
And it allowed me to find community.
Yeah.
It allowed me to find other people who were like me. And because I found that community, I found out coping skills and strategies that other people had used and shared. And that gave me a lot of, I guess, ownership over both my identity, but also how I interacted with the world.
Yeah. And so as you're in college, do you start to get involved? At what point did you start getting involved in politics? At what point did you start to get, like a lot of us, what point did you start getting pissed off over what was going on?
Yeah. So I was a political science and communication double major.
Okay.
So I think I was involved in politics from the beginning.
Yeah.
And I mean, even as a child, election night would roll around, and that was a night my parents let me stay up until the results were in. So I would put this big map on the wall and I would color in the states
awesome.
as the results came in. And so I think, I had a fascination with politics and with the ways in which politics empowered some people and disempowered other people.
Yeah.
And going to college and studying political science and communication gave me more tools to understand how the political world works.
Yeah. Was there a race or anything that you remember particularly getting energy? So I am very proud that I never say that my first vote, I voted for Bill Clinton. I say I got to vote against George Bush, and then I got to vote against Bush twice more. So those are the kind of things that sort of excited me. And it was always on that presidential level that first kind of peaked. And I was born in 71. So, I was starting to become aware as it was, Ford rolling into Carter and so forth. But it was really like 80s and 90s politics that really sort of got me involved. Was there either an issue or a race or something that made you just sort of energized you or got you jazzed about politics?
Yeah. So I'm a December baby.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of things that are great about being a December baby. There are a lot of things that are awful. You get birthday presents wrapped in Christmas paper.
Right.
Sometimes Christmas and your birthday celebration get combined.
Right.
And you happen to be a month too young to vote in the 2008 presidential election.
Oh.
Which, as somebody who was very attuned and interested in politics, frustrated me to no end.
Right.
So when President Obama's reelection rolled around, I was super jazzed to be able to go and vote. And, you know, the fascinating thing, right, about voting in Minnesota is they have same-day registration.
Oh, right, yeah.
So I could walk up with my student ID, register, and then vote.
Right.
And that process meant that voting was something that more and more people were able to do. We have a lot of barriers to voting in the state of Pennsylvania. Right. And so moving back here, changing my registration, figuring all of that out, you know, there's just this stark contrast between the accessibility of voting in Minnesota and the lack thereof here in Pennsylvania.
And so let's kind of move ahead. I know that you've done a lot of activism. You've worked with labor unions, correct? And I do want to make sure I made a little note here. I want to get back to ask you a specific question about the unions. So what brought you to this point where this is your time? Did you decide why is it this time to run against Mr. Representative Readshaw?
Yeah. So, you know, I talk about being excited to vote for Obama's reelection. Yeah. But it was hard to get excited about local politics anywhere because I didn't see candidates that got me excited. Right. You know, we give people a lot of flack for not voting, but we don't talk about why they don't show up. Yeah. And so to see candidates like Sarah and Summer, Lindsey Williams, Bethany, Liv, you know, the list goes on, right? That really energized me for the possibilities of local politics, for lifting up the voices and concerns of marginalized populations. And, you know, again, like I said, growing up, I didn't see people like me in office. Right. So I never thought, right? I'm an activist. I'm a community organizer. Yeah. I'm somebody who holds politicians accountable when they fail my community. And, you know, I'm a judge of elections in my local precinct. And so primary day 2018, I am sitting there and I'm getting texts from all of my friends who are poll watching for these exciting women who are running for office. Meanwhile, I'm sitting in a polling place that seems empty. Right. And that's because there were no races. Right. No competitive races. And so I sat there and I said to myself, well, you know what? I will find someone to run. I will find somebody to do this thing. Right.
So you didn't know it was you that day.
It's time. I didn't know it was me that day. I knew somebody needed to do it because democracy only works when you have a choice. Yeah. And, you know, the incumbent has only had a challenger once. Yeah. And he's been in office since I was 4. Wow. So, you know, when we think about the fact that there are people who are eligible to vote today who were not alive when he was elected to office, and he's only had a challenger once. Right. You know, that's not really democracy if you don't have a choice. Right. And so, you know, I said, all right, I'll find somebody to do this thing. And, you know, more and more people, because I was going to lots of community meetings and meetings in neighborhoods that weren't my own at this point as well, to meet people and find out who might be, you know, and the more and more people who I met and talked to about the issues that I was passionate about and why I was looking, they said that I should. And I kind of laughed at people. I was like, nobody like me ever has. Yeah. How could we, right? You know, I have been openly autistic, openly bisexual, proudly so, and I'm never ashamed of those things. Yeah. But I know that there is stigma. Mm-hmm. I see the way Greta, you know, the climate activist, is treated because of being autistic. And so I know it's not easy. It's never been easy. Right. But eventually I said, all right, okay, it needs to be done. Yeah. And you're right. I think I could do a decent job at this thing. Sure. And it's I would think that it's almost like, I mean, it's sad sometimes that, you know, we have to break down the wall a little bit at a time. And so you had that election where, number one, it's, you know,
male or female, nobody's going to beat these entrenched Democrats. That's the first thing that comes out. And then all of a sudden, as the election draws near, people are thinking, wait a minute now, something's odd is happening. And so then you have those upsets. And although a lot of the vote totals don't look like upsets. And then you have Bethany Hallam, who is just one of my favorite people. She's energetic and she's fun and funny, but she really cares about what she's doing. So then you have, she's obviously a woman running for office, but she's also a woman running for office who also has the stigma of being an addict, a recovering addict. And so are these the things that you're seeing that you're like, maybe, voters aren't going to look past me maybe for X, Y, or Z. Maybe this is the time when people are more willing to give someone else a chance.
We've been seeing a lot of firsts in Allegheny County. And to me, that gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I campaigned for Bethany and live in South Pittsburgh. Mm-hmm. Bethany kind of divided the county into quadrants. And I said, well, I live in South Pittsburgh. I'll organize some folks to do this thing. And, I'm not a crier. And I bawled when Bethany and Liv won. I just, and it was because of, these are powerful women who are breaking down walls. Yeah. They are redefining what it means to be a politician. And, seeing how they've paved the way, I said, all right, we can be ourselves and do the job without compromising our values. Because that's always the fear, right? You have this activist who's been fighting for justice that they might get corrupted by the system. Right. And so to see these amazing activists who have taken that fighting spirit to, the county level, to the city level, to school board, and to Harrisburg, I know it's possible to be an activist and maintain that spirit and fight for your community in the State House.
And I was looking, you can go to her website, which is benham4pa.com, and there you have a summary of a quick summary of some of the issues that major issues in the state and your sort of hot take on these things. What are some of these issues, 2 or 3 or more, whatever, that you see where current representation is sort of failing in those areas, and where can you make the difference?
Yeah, so I think that with my background in healthcare policy and disability rights activism, that's one of the issues that I have a lot of expertise and ability to make a difference. So that means looking at issues like making healthcare free at the point of access. I know what it's like not to be able to afford medical care. The new health insurance year just rolled around for me, and I learned that my copay is quadrupled.
Wow.
And for somebody like me who has multiple pre-existing conditions, that's serious, right? I'm a broke grad student nonprofit person. I don't make a lot of money. Right. And so for me, it's an issue that hits close to home and an issue that should have disabled voices at the table. But it also means talking about our crisis of addiction. Yeah. And talking about it in a way that is well-rounded. Because I think so often we talk about it in one of 2 ways. We talk about it as an issue of healthcare, or we'll talk about it as an issue of criminalization. And neither of those is an accurate or full picture of what's going on. We have to look at root causes. We have to talk about people living in poverty, people in pain, people not having access to adequate health care, people being poisoned by the air or water. It's not people who are failing in some kind of moral way. We have to look at it holistically and talk about what we can fix on the ground level to make it so that fewer people are entrenched in opioid addiction or any other kind of addiction. Right.
And obviously, 2 things again that certainly affect your life directly. There's been this stall in the state of Pennsylvania on LGBTQ anti-discrimination legislation. And there's also been not a stall, but an outright attack on reproductive rights. So can you talk a little bit about those two issues and if you have sort of sort of an idea of maybe again what you bring to the table that Harry doesn't, and then a little bit of how you will look at and attack these issues.
Yeah. So as somebody who would be the first openly LGBTQ woman elected to the state legislature in Pennsylvania, I think I bring a particular perspective when we're talking about LGBTQ civil rights. You know, I can be fired from my job with no consequences for being bisexual, for being openly bisexual. Right. And now again, I want to acknowledge I've got some privilege there. Married a dude, you know? But I think it's just, as people say, I picked a person, not a side.
Exactly.
You know? I very well could have ended up, you know.
Sure.
Carl's wonderful though. And I think Bethel University, where I got my undergrad, is a religious college. And, you know, at the time that I went, I think things have changed a little bit now, but at the time that I went, you could face serious consequences for being out. And so I wasn't out. You know, I did date women in college.
Right.
But you couldn't be out. And so when I think about, you know, the consequences, the impact that could have had on my education if I had been outed. Right. You know, those are experiences and memories that really drive me to fight for those protections.
What was that time like for you? And at what point did you realize that you were bisexual, I guess obviously at some point before you went to college maybe, but then so what did that do to you? I can't even imagine, mentally, even physically. It's got to take a toll to pretend that you're not who you are.
Yeah, so, you know, I grew up in a religious family, going to a church where being LGBTQ was not a thing that was allowed and not even a thing that was really talked about. Right. This was also a church where, you know, disability, those stories were intros to sermons where somebody got healed magically, you know, and sitting there as a bisexual, disabled kid hearing these stories, I think, you know, that makes it harder to know who you are. And I think I realized pretty early on, I couldn't tell anybody. Sure. You know, there was nowhere in my life where I would have felt safe growing up sharing that information. And so in many ways, going to college was a way for me to have some freedom. Right. To be more honest about who I was, even if I couldn't be out. Right. Yeah. But to be a little bit more honest. Sure. There was a surprisingly large underground LGBTQ community at Bethel.
That's great.
And, you know, you find a lot of community in those places, but you also find a lot of fear. Yeah. And a lot of hurt.
And that's where you start getting, when you look at the statistics of suicide rates or attempted suicide rates among folks in the LGBTQ community. That's where I would never pretend to even think what that could be like. But, you know, just from, you know, it's when talking to someone like you who's been through that experience, you really kind of see that, you get the picture of, okay, that's how that can happen. Like, I couldn't imagine just being at a place and not being able to just openly say or admit who you are.
You feel really alone.
Yeah.
You know, and I think it's important to acknowledge a little bit of an intersection here, because it's been, you know, colloquial wisdom in the autistic community for a long time, but we finally have studies to back it up. Right. That there are higher rates of LGBTQ people in the autistic population than in the population at large. So to think about the ways in which autistic people are further siloed, are further left to feel alone, and to combine those two things together and feel the combined impact of that weight, it's something. Yeah. And, Yeah, I mean, I think you can probably hear a lot of the pain in my voice when I
Yeah,
talk
no
about
question.
this.
And that's why I wasn't even sure if I wanted to to do the follow up, because I saw it and I could hear it, and that's what I said. I can't even. It's just I can say that I grew up in a religious household, and I grew up in a church similar to what you're explaining, so I know exactly, you know, the kind of pressure that you're talking about.
And not all churches are like that.
No,
Right?
no,
It took me a solid decade to go
yeah,
back to church. And I
right,
will say, I go to a hot metal faith community
yeah,
now. And I even struggle calling it a church.
yeah, yeah,
It is a fantastic gathering of people who, church is about community for me.
yeah,
And, after missing that community in my life
yeah,
for, 10 or so years, I was looking. And to find a church where not only did they say that LGBTQ people could participate in all aspects of the
right,
church, they actually lived that.
yeah,
And beyond that, they fully welcome disabled people, which, let me tell you, does not happen as often as it should in religious circles, right? Churches should be leading the way on accessibility.
yeah,
And instead, some of them hide behind the fact that they're not legally bound by the ADA to not make those changes.
right.
And so what I'll say about my church is they have sign language interpretation every Sunday morning.
Right.
And the building is accessible in all kinds of ways.
Yeah, a lot of people who grew up in the church, and who find their way back tend to find their way back to hot metal. So that's kind of cool. I still haven't found my way back. I don't know if I ever will.
Hey, but, that's all
right. We are talking. I've been enjoying so much my conversation with Jessica Benham that I haven't said you were listening to the Pittsburgh Current podcast on Sorgatron Media from beautiful Beachview Business District. So we talked a lot. We did talk some politics, Jessica, but we talked a lot about your personal experiences. So I just want to. I mean, is there anything that you'd like to sort of mention or talk about that? Because I've got 12,000 more questions, but no more time. So do you have what kind of things, if you had a couple of things that you wanted to leave our listeners with about your campaign coming up, what would they be?
Sure. So I think I didn't totally answer the last question
Right.
you asked, because we didn't get to talk about reproductive justice.
Yes, correct.
So I think we should talk about that.
Let's do it.
A little bit, just briefly.
Yeah.
So one of the most recent attacks in Pennsylvania on reproductive justice was the Down syndrome abortion bill.
Yes.
And I think, as somebody with a developmental disability, I bring a particular, very useful perspective on that conversation.
Yeah.
Because one thing we don't see is the voices of disabled parents in that conversation.
Right.
We hear a lot of talk about, protecting people, but we don't hear a lot of talk about centering those voices. Disabled parents are more likely than abled parents to get their kids taken away from them.
Right.
Simply by virtue of the fact that they're disabled. They're less likely to be able to marry for fear of losing their benefits, which has an impact on kids in the home, or the ability to have and pay and care for kids, right? Because as we know, married couples in this country receive all kinds of benefits,
right,
and those benefits trickle down to kids. So there's no conversation about that. There's no conversation about how people claim to want to protect the rights of people with disabilities, but won't vote to fully fund Medicaid waivers.
Right.
And so when we're having these conversations, ostensibly trying to protect the rights of disabled people, but not actually centering their voices or hearing from them about the things that they actually need, that's a problem.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's kind of the takeaway here today, which is you're going to come at all of these issues that we've all talked about 1,000 times. You're going to come at this with a completely different perspective. I think that's good for people to hear, regardless of how things shake out. I think it's great to have the voice in the race and the voice, and for you to be able to do, 3 or 4 interviews in one day, which to get the message out, which is great. And we need that in all facets of politics. I mean, it's diverse voices is something that we've been missing a long time. And I think we're making inroads. I don't know in the scheme of things, if we're catching up with that, but it's certainly, we're getting there, it seems.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to work to represent all of the people
Yeah.
in House District 36. And what I will say is, you know, when a policy is good for the most marginalized among us,
Yeah.
when a policy is good for people of color, especially Black or Indigenous people of color, when it's good for LGBTQ people, when it's good for disabled people, it's good for all of us.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the particular perspective that I bring, which is to say, I'm going to fight for everybody.
Yeah.
And I'm going to center voices that have long gone unheard.
Yeah. And just finally, so how do you, what's the game plan? What's the first 2 or 3 month game plan here? What is your plan to start out?
Absolutely. So my plan is to keep doing a lot of what I've already been doing. You know, we got to raise some money.
Yeah.
Because, you know, that's money and politics go hand in hand. And that's rough. As somebody who, you know, grew up poor, is working class, I don't know a lot of rich people. So got to raise some money.
Right.
But I'm going to keep doing the thing where I go to community meetings. I'm not making big speeches. You know, I'm going to sit there. I'm going to listen. I'm going to hear about what people care about. I'm going to hear about how they want to solve the issues that impact them. And I'm going to take those messages and I'm going to weave them into this campaign. Because this campaign isn't about me. It's about co-governance. It's about creating a District 36 that has a brighter future for everybody who lives in it.
Well, if you see Jessica Benham at your community meeting, you should say hi and talk to her because I've enjoyed my conversation today. It's really been a great show, and I appreciate you coming, Jessica. Good luck in the coming months, and I'm sure we're going to have you back on as this thing keeps rolling through.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me today.
Absolutely. And this has been the Pittsburgh Current podcast. New issue of the Pittsburgh Current comes out on Tuesday, October 1st. You can get our fall guide with more than 400. No, that was somebody else who said there were only 100 things to do. We're saying there are more than 400 things to do this fall. So check us out wherever fine free publications are handed out. This has been the Pittsburgh Current podcast. Have a good week.
A better alternative. Giving Pittsburgh a better alternative. Giving Pittsburgh a better alternative.
This show is a member of the Sorgatron Media Podcast Network. Find out more at sorgatronmedia.com.